Bracketing is something you do for several reasons. Sometimes it's because you may not be sure if the exposure the meter is giving you will be the correct one. Sometimes you bracket to use the photographs later in Photoshop when you merge to HDR. There are other reasons for using it too that are expressive when you want to get a picture that may not be what the meter tells you is right, but it fits your own artistic sensibilities. To bracket, you meter once. You get what we call the meter indicated exposure, or the MIE. After that, you don't use the meter, you simply set the aperture or shutter. In this exercise, you'll do two. You will do bracketing with the aperture and bracketing with the shutter. When we do bracket with the aperture, the shutter stays the same as the MIE or meter indicated shutter. When we bracket with the shutter, the aperture will stay exactly where it was for the meter indicated exposure. It will allow in different lights. Now, many cameras come with the ability to either bracket in 1/2 stop increments or 1/3 stop increments. We're going to use 1/3. Usually that's the default setting on your camera, so make sure it's set there for 1/3 stop indicators. In order to know for sure whether or not that's the case, we have a chart that's available that shows you 1/2 and 1/3 stops, and this is that chart. We'll refer to that chart later when checking. Now, I've already metered my scene out here. The meter indicated exposure is 1/250th of a second at f11. I'm going to take a picture now at that exposure, double check it, and that's my meter indicated exposure. From now on, I'm not going to check the light meter at all. I'm simply going to adjust the aperture or shutter to get 6 more shots for each half of the assignment. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the aperture. I can do this simply by dialing in the next apertures that are available. You need to be careful and refer to that chart to make sure you don't skip any along the way. I'm going to make a smaller aperture, which will make it a minus exposure. And do one more. And I'm doing this in 1/3 stop increments. Until I have 1 full stop underexposed from my meter indicated exposure. I'll go back to the meter indicated aperture and go the other way now, making the aperture larger. Until I've achieved 1 full stop overexposed with my aperture. Now I'm going to change the scene just to keep things easier and do the same thing for the shutter with a different scene. As it is, the light is very consistent out here, and my meter indicated exposure is the same as it was for the aperture side. I'll take a picture of that at the MIE, and now I'll go back and underexpose by making the shutter progressively faster. And I'll do this until I've gotten 1 stop underexposed via the shutter. And go all the way until I get my final shot overexposed via the shutter. 7 shots total for each scene, 7 for the aperture bracketing, 7 for the shutter bracketing. Now let's go look and see what it looks like in the back of the camera for the settings as I dial through it. This is a view of the exposure indicators. What you need to pay attention to this time is the shutter and aperture that are my MIE. The shutter is 250 and the aperture is f11. When I bracket with the aperture, I'm going to step through it, first going progressively darker in thirds until I get 1 stop darker, which is f16. Going the other way, I will go brighter with the aperture until I get 1 stop brighter with an aperture of f8 plus all of the increments in between. If I'm going to use the shutter to do this, I go and do that, leaving the aperture the same as I left the shutter the same on the other one, going 1/3 stop darker, 2/3 stop darker, and 1 whole stop darker. And going the other way, 1/3 stop brighter, 2/3 stop brighter, 1 whole stop brighter. And I'm going to do that on both sides of the assignment, making each one of these 7-shot part. Here are the results of bracketing the scenes that we shot. Our meter indicated exposure, our MIE, is shown in the red squares. That meter indicated exposure was 1/250th of a second at f11. When we use the shutter to bracket, we're going to leave the aperture at f11 for all 7 shots. When we use the aperture to bracket, we're going to leave the shutter speed at 1/250th of a second for all of the shots. Let's look at the squares next to 250th of a second. Remember, for this, when we bracket with a shutter, the aperture stays at f11 the whole time. In blue are the 1/3 stop increments, and in green are the full stop increments. So 1/500th of a second is 1 full stop darker than a 250th. 1/125th of a second is 1 stop brighter, or +1. 1/320 is -0.3, 1/400th is -0.7, 1/200th is +0.3, and 1/160 is +0.7. We use all of those to take a picture of the same scene in the same lighting condition and leaving the aperture at f11 to bracket with the shutter. Going over to the right side of the page, if we're going to bracket with the aperture, we need to leave the shutter speed at a 250th of a second, and that's what we did. Our MIE is an aperture of f11. 1 full stop brighter is f8. That's our +1. 1 full stop darker is f16. That's -1. And the 3rd stop increments are indicated in blue. Therefore, f10 is +0.3, f9 is +0.7, f13 is -0.3, and f14 is -0.7. Again, when we use the aperture to bracket, when we change the aperture, we're going to leave the shutter at exactly the indicated shutter speed of a 250th of a second. When we're changing these settings to bracket, we no longer use the exposure indicators on the camera. After the MIE is attained, the meter indicated exposure, you will not use the light meter to tell you where to set it. You will use this chart to tell you where to set your exposures. Now we'll look at some of the key points you need to remember, and then we'll look at the results of our bracketing, and it will show these exposure settings that are used for each picture that is there.